Welcome back to A Clock in the Journal. A move is made, not in haste, but with intent, measured, controlled. A gamble, yes, but not without design. He knows the board, knows the pieces. But this time, the stakes feel different. Higher, closer. Every step forward narrows the path behind him. There is no retreat here, only progression. Because a true gambit does not ask for safety. It demands commitment. And once played, it cannot be undone. Chapter 6. Camilla Belsize. It would be hard to find a better refuge on a rainy day than the amphibious retreat described by Raffles as, quote, country house in Kensington. There was a good square hall full of the club comforts so welcome in a home, such as magazines and cigarettes, and a fire when the rain set in. The usual rooms opened off the hall, and the library was not the only one that led on into the conservatory. The drawing room was another, in which I heard voices as I lit a cigarette among the palms and tree ferns. It struck me that poor Mr. Garland was finding it hard work to propitiate the lady whom Raffles had deemed unworthy of mention overnight. But I own I was in no hurry to take over the invidious task. To me it need prove nothing more. To him, anguish, but I could not help feeling that even as matters stood, I was quite sufficiently embroiled in these people's affairs. Their name had been little more than a name to me until the last few hours. Only yesterday I might have hesitated to nod to Teddy Garland at the club, so seldom had we met. Yet here was I helping Raffles to keep the worst about the son from the father's knowledge, and on the point of helping that father to keep what might easily prove worse still from his daughter-in-law-to-be. And all the time there was the worst of all to be hidden from everybody concerning Raffles and me. Meanwhile, I explored a system of flower houses and vineries that ran out from the conservatory in a continuous chain, each link with its own temperature and its individual scent, and not a pane, but rattled and streamed beneath the timely torrent. It was in a fernery where a playing fountain added its tuneful drop to the noisy deluge that the voices of the drawing-room sounded suddenly at my elbow, and I was introduced to Miss Belsize before I could recover from my surprise. My foolish face must have made her smile in spite of herself, for I did not see quite the same smile again all day, but it made me her admirer on the spot, and I really think she warmed to me for amusing her even for a moment. So we began rather well. And that was a mercy in the light of poor Mr. Garland's cynically prompt departure, but we did not go on quite as well as we had begun. I do not say that Miss Belsize was in a bad temper, but emphatically she was not pleased, and I for one had the utmost sympathy with her displeasure. She was simply but exquisitely dressed, with unostentatious touches of Cambridge blue, and a picture hat that really was a picture. Yet on a perfect stranger in a humid rockery she was wasting what had been meant for mankind at Lord's. The only consolation I could suggest was that by this time Lord's would be more humid still. And so there's something to be said for being bored to tears under shelter, Miss Belsize. Miss Belsize did not deny that she was bored. But there's plenty of shelter there, said she, packed with draggled dresses and squelching shoes. You might swim for it before they admitted you to that pavilion, you know. But if the ground's under water, how can they play today? They can't, Miss Belsize. I don't mind betting. That was a rash remark. Then why doesn't Teddy come back? Oh, well, you know, I hedged. You can never be quite absolutely sure. It might clear up. They're bound to give it a chance until the afternoon, and the players can't leave till stumps are drawn. I should have thought Teddy could have come home to lunch, said Miss Belsize, even if he had to go back afterwards. I shouldn't wonder if he did come, said I, conceiving the bare possibility, and AJ with him. Do you mean Mr. Raffles? Yes, Miss Belsize. He's the only AJ that counts. Camilla Belsize turned slightly in the basket chair to which she had confided her delicate frock, and our eyes met almost for the first time. Certainly we had not exchanged so long a look before, for she had been watching the torpid goldfish in the rockery pool, and I admiring her bold profile and the querulous poise of a fine head as I tried to argue her out of all desire for Lords. Suddenly our eyes met, as I say, and hers dazzled me. They were soft and yet brilliant, tender and yet cynical, calmly reckless, audaciously sentimental, all that and more as I see them now on looking back, but at the time I was merely dazzled. "So you and Mr. Raffles are great friends?" said Miss Belsize, harking back to a remark of Mr. Garland's in introducing us. "Rather," I replied. "Are you as great a friend of his as Teddy is?" I liked that, but simply said I was an older friend. "Raffles and I were at school together," I added loftily. "Really? I should have thought he was before your time." "No, only senior to me. I happened to be his fag." "And what sort of a schoolboy was Mr. Raffles?" inquired Miss Belsize, not by any means in the tone of a devotee. But I reflected that her own devotion was bespoke, and not improbably tainted with some little jealousy of Raffles. "He was the most admirable Crichton who was ever at the school," said I. "Captain of the 11, the fastest man in the 15, athletic champion, and an ornament of the upper 6th. "And you worshipped him, I suppose?" "Absolutely." My companion had been taking renewed interest in the goldfish. Now she looked at me again with the cynical light full on in her eyes. "You must be rather disappointed in him now." "Disappointed? Why?" I asked with much outward amusement. But I was beginning to feel uncomfortable. "Of course I don't know much about him," remarked Miss Belsize as though she cared less. "But does anybody know anything of Mr. Raffles except as a cricketer?" "I do," said I with injudicious alacrity. "Well," said Miss Belsize, "what else is he?" "The best fellow in the world, among other things." "But what other things?" "Ask Teddy," I said unluckily. "I have," replied Miss Belsize, "but Teddy doesn't know. He often wonders how Mr. Raffles can afford to play so much cricket without doing any work." "Does he indeed?" "Many people do." "And what do they say about him?" Miss Belsize hesitated, watching me for a moment, and the goldfish rather longer. The rain sounded louder, and the fountain as though it had been turned on again, before she answered, "More than their prayers, no doubt." "Do you mean," I almost gasped, "as to the way Raffles gets his living?" "Yes. You might tell me the kind of things they say, Miss Belsize, but if there's no truth in them, I'll soon tell you if there is or not." "But suppose I don't care either way," said Miss Belsize with a brilliant smile. "Then I care so much that I should be extremely grateful to you. Mind, I don't believe it myself, Mr. Manders. You don't believe that Mr. Raffles lives by his wits and his cricket." I jumped to my feet. "Is that all they say about him?" I cried. "Isn't it enough?" asked Miss Belsize, astonished in her turn at my demeanor. "Oh, quite enough, said I. "It's only the most scandalously unfair and utterly untrue report that ever got about, that's all." This heavy irony was, of course, intended to convey the impression that one's first explosion of relief had been equally ironical. But I was to discover that Camilla Belsize was never easily deceived. It was unpleasantly apparent in her bold eyes before she opened her firm mouth. "Yet you seem to expect something worse," she said at length. "What could be worse?" I asked, my back against the wall of my own indiscretion. "Why, a man like A.J. Raffles would rather be any mortal thing than a paid amateur. But you haven't told me what he is, Mr. Manders." "And you haven't told me, Miss Belsize, why you're so interested in A.J. after all," I retorted, getting home for once and sitting down again on the strength of it. But Miss Belsize was my superior to the last. In the single moment of my ascendancy, she made me blush for it and for myself. She would be quite frank with me. My friend Mr. Raffles did interest her rather more than she cared to say. It was because Teddy thought so much of him, that was the only reason, and her one excuse for all inquisitive questions and censorious remarks. I must have thought her very rude, but now I knew. Mr. Raffles had been such a friend to Teddy. Sometimes she wondered whether he was quite a good friend, and there I had the whole thing in a nutshell. I had indeed, and I knew the nut, and had tasted its bitter kernel too often to make any mistake about it. Jealousy was its other name. But I did not care how jealous Miss Belsize became of Raffles, as long as jealousy did not beget suspicion. And my mind was not entirely relieved on that point. We dropped the whole subject, however, with some abruptness, and the rest of our conversation in the rockery and in the steaming orchid house and further vineries which we proceeded to explore together was quite refreshingly tame. Yet I think it was on this desultory tour, to the still incessant accompaniment of rain on the glasshouses, that Camilla's mother took shape in my mind as the Lady Laura Belsize, an apparently impecunious widow reduced to semi-detachment down the river, and suburban neighbors whose manners and customs my companion hit off with vivacious intolerance. She told me how she had shocked them by smoking cigarettes in the back garden, and pronounced a gratuitous conviction that I, of all people, would have been no less scandalized. That was in the uttermost vinery, and in another minute 2 Sullivans were in full blast under the vines. I remember discovering that the great brand was not unfamiliar to Miss Belsize, and even gathering that it was Raffles himself who had made it known to her. Raffles, whom she did not know much about, or consider quite a good friend for Teddy Garland. I was becoming curious to see this antagonistic pair together, but it was the middle of the afternoon before Raffles reappeared, though Mr. Garland told me he had received an optimistic note from him by special messenger earlier in the day. I felt I might have been told a little more, considering the intimate part one was already playing as a stranger in a strange house, but I was only too thankful to find that Raffles had so far infected our host with his confidence as to tide us through luncheon with far fewer embarrassments than before. Nor did Mr. Garland desert us again until the butler with a visitor's card brought about his abrupt departure from the conservatory. Then my troubles began afresh. It stopped raining at last. If Miss Belsize could have had her way, we should all have started for Lord's that minute. I took her into the garden to show her the state of the lawns, coldly scintillant with standing water and rimmed by regular canals. Lord's would be like them, only 50 times worse. Play had no doubt been abandoned on that quagmire for the day. Miss Belsize was not so sure about that. Why should we not drive over and find out? I said that was the surest way of missing Teddy. She said a hansom would take us there and back in a half an hour. I gained time disputing that statement, but said if we went at all I was sure Mr. Garland would want to go with us, and that in his own brougham. All this on the crown of a sloppy path, and when Miss Belsize asked me how many more times I was going to change my ground, I could not help looking at her absurd shoes sinking into the softened gravel, and saying I thought it was for her to do that. Miss Belsize took my advice to the extent of turning upon a submerged heel, though with none too complimentary a smile, and then it was that I saw what I had been curious to see all day. Raffles was coming down the path towards us, and I saw Miss Belsize hesitate and stiffen before shaking hands with him. "They've given it up as a bad job at last," said he. "I've just come from Lord's, and Teddy won't be very long." "Why didn't you bring him with you?" asked Miss Belsize pertinently. "Well, I thought you ought to know the worst at once," said Raffles, rather lamely for him. "And then a man playing in a varsity match is never quite his own master, you know. Still, he oughtn't to keep you waiting much longer." It was perhaps unfortunately put. At any rate, Miss Belsize took it pretty plainly amiss, and I saw her color rise as she declared she had been waiting in the hope of seeing some cricket. Since that was at an end, she must be thinking of getting home, and would just say goodbye to Mr. Garland. This sudden decision took me as much by surprise as I believe it took Miss Belsize herself. But having announced her intention, however hot-headedly, she proceeded to action by way of the conservatory and the library door, while Raffles and I went through into the hall the other way. "I'm afraid I've put my foot in it," said he to me, "but it's just as well, since I needn't tell you there's no sign of Teddy up at Lord's." "Have you been there all day?" I asked him under my breath. "Except when I went to the office of this rag," replied Raffles, brandishing an evening paper that ill-deserved his epithet. "See what they say about Teddy here," and I held my breath while Raffles showed me a stupendous statement in the stop press column. It was to the effect that E.M. Garland, Eton and Trinity, might be unable to keep wicket for Cambridge after all, owing to the serious illness of his father. "His father?" I exclaimed. "Why, his father's closeted with somebody or other at this very moment behind the door you're looking at." "I know, Bunny, I've seen him. But what an extraordinary fabrication to get into a decent paper." I don't wonder you went to the office about it. You'll wonder still less when I tell you I have an old pal on the staff. Of course you made him take it straight out? On the contrary, Bunny, I persuaded him to put it in. And Raffles chuckled in my face as I have known him, chuckle over many a more felonious but less incomprehensible exploit. Didn't you see, Bunny, how bad the poor old boy looked in his library this morning? That gave me my idea. The fiction is at least founded on fact. I wonder you don't see the point. As a matter of fact, there are 2 points, just as there were 2 jobs I took on this morning. One was to find Teddy, and the other was to save his face at Lord's. Well, I haven't actually found him yet, but if he's in the land of the living, he will see this statement, and when he does see it, even you may guess what he will do. Meanwhile, there's nothing but sympathy for him at Lord's. Studley couldn't have been nicer. A place will be kept for Teddy up to the 11th hour tomorrow, and if that isn't killing 2 birds with 1 stone, Bunny, may I never perform the feat. But what will old Garland say, AJ? He has already said, Bunny. I told him what I was doing in a note before lunch, and the moment I arrived just now he came out to hear what I had done. He doesn't mind what I do, so long as I find Teddy and save his face before the world at large and Miss Belsize in particular. Look out, Bunny. Here she is. The excitement in his whisper was not characteristic of Raffles, but it was less remarkable than the change in Camilla Belsize as she entered the hall through the drawing room as we had done before her. For one moment I suspected her of eavesdropping. Then I saw that all traces of personal pique had vanished from her face, and that some anxiety for another had taken its place. She came up to Raffles and me as though she had forgiven both of us our trespasses of 2 or 3 minutes ago. I didn't go into the library after all, she said, looking askance at the library door. I am afraid Mr. Garland is having a trying interview with somebody. I had just a glimpse of the man's face as I hesitated, and I thought I recognized him. Who was it? I asked, for I myself had wondered who the rather mysterious visitor might be for whom Mr. Garland had deserted us so abruptly in the conservatory, and with whom he was still conferring in the hour of so many issues. I believe it's a dreadful man I know by sight down the river, said Miss Belsize, and hardly had she spoke before the library door opened and out came the dreadful man in the portentous person of Dan Levy, the usurer of European notoriety, our victim of the morning and our certain enemy for life. Chapter 7, in which we failed to score. Mr. Levy sailed in with frock coat flying, shiny hat in hand. He was evidently prepared for us, and Raffles for once behaved as though we were prepared for Mr. Levy. Of myself I cannot speak. I was ready for a terrific scene, but Raffles was magnificent, and to do our enemy justice, he was quite as good. They faced each other with a nod and a smile of mutual suavity, shot with underlying animosity on the one side and delightful defiance on the other. Not a word was said or a tone employed to betray the true situation between the 3 of us, for I took my cue from the 2 protagonists just in time to preserve the triple truce. Meanwhile, Mr. Garland, obviously distressed as he was, and really ill as he looked, was not the least successful of us in hiding his emotions, for having expressed a grim satisfaction in the coincidence of our all knowing each other, he added that he supposed Miss Belsize was an exception, and presented Mr. Levy forthwith as though he were an ordinary guest. "You must find a better exception than this young lady," cried that worthy, with a certain aplomb. "I know you very well by sight, Miss Belsize, and your mother, Lady Laura, into the bargain." "Really," said Miss Belsize, without returning the compliment at her command. "The bargain," muttered Raffles to me with sly irony. The echo was not meant for Levy's ears, but it reached them nevertheless, and was taken up with adroit urbanity. "I didn't mean to use a trade term," explained the Jew, "though bargains, I confess, are somewhat in my line, and I don't often get the worst of one, Mr. Raffles. When I do, the other fellow usually lives to repent it." It was said with a laugh for the lady's benefit, but with a gleam of the eyes for ours. Raffles answered the laugh with a much heartier one. The look he ignored. I saw Miss Belsize beginning to watch the pair, and only interrupted by the arrival of the tea-tray, over which Mr. Garland begged her to preside. "Mr. Garland seemed to have an anxious eye upon us all in turn. At Raffles he looked wistfully as though burning to get him to himself for further consultation, but the fact that he refrained from doing so, coupled with a grimly punctilious manner towards the moneylender, gave the impression that his son's whereabouts was no longer the sole anxiety. "And yet," remarked Miss Belsize as we formed a group about her in the firelight, "you seem to have met your match the other day, Mr. Levy." "Where was that, Miss Belsize?" "Somewhere on the continent, wasn't it?" "It got into the newspapers, I know, but I forget the name of the place." "Do you mean when my wife and I were robbed at Carlsbad?" I was holding my breath now, as I had not held it all day. Raffles was merely smiling into his teacup as one who knew all about the affair. "Carlsbad it was," certified Miss Belsize, as though it mattered. "I remember now." "I don't call that meeting your match," said the moneylender. "An unarmed man with a frightened wife at his elbow is no match for a desperate criminal with a loaded revolver." "Was it as bad as all that?" whispered Camilla Belsize. Up to this point, one had felt her to be forcing the unlucky topic with the best of intentions towards us all. Now she was interested in the episode for its own sake, and eager for more details than Mr. Levy had a mind to impart. "It makes a good tale, I know," said he, "but I shall prefer telling it when they've got the man. If you want to know any more, Miss Belsize, you'd better ask Mr. Raffles. He was in our hotel and came in for all the excitement, but it was just a trifle too exciting for me and my wife." "Raffles at Carlsbad?" exclaimed Mr. Garland. Miss Belsize only stared. "Yes," said Raffles, "that's where I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Levy." "Didn't you know he was there?" inquired the moneylender of our host. And he looked sharply at Raffles, as Mr. Garland replied that this was the first he had heard of it. "But it's the first we've seen of each other, sir," said Raffles, "except those few minutes this morning. And I told you, I only got back last night. But you never told me you had been at Carlsbad, Raffles." "It's a sore subject, you see," said Raffles, with a sigh and a laugh. "Isn't it, Mr. Levy? You seem to find it so," replied the moneylender. They were standing face to face in the firelight, each with a shoulder against the massive chimney-piece, and Camilla Belsize was still staring at them both from her place behind the tea-tray. And I was watching the three of them by turns from the other side of the hall. "But you're the fittest man I know, Raffles," pursued old Garland with terrible tact. "What on earth were you doing at a place like Carlsbad?" "The cure," said Raffles. "There's nothing else to do there, is there, Mr. Levy?" Levy replied with his eyes on Raffles, "Unless you've got to cope with a swell mobsman who steals your wife's jewels and then gets in such a funk that he practically gives them back again." The emphasized term was the one that Dan Levy had applied to Raffles and myself in his own office that very morning. "Did he give them back again?" asked Camilla Belsize, breaking her silence on an eager note. Raffles turned to her at once. "The jewels were found buried in the woods," said he. "Out there, everybody thought the thief had simply hidden them. But no doubt Mr. Levy has the better information." Mr. Levy smiled sardonically in the firelight. And it was at this point I followed the example of Miss Belsize and put in my one belated word. "I shouldn't have thought there was such a thing as a swell mob in the wilds of Austria," said I. "There isn't," admitted the moneylender readily. "But your true mobsman knows his whole blooming continent, as well as Piccadilly Circus. His EAD quarters are in London, but a week's journey at an hour's notice is nothing to him if the swag looks worth it. Mrs. Levy's necklace was actually taken at Carlsbad, for instance, but the odds are that it was marked down at some London theatre or restaurant, Mr. Raffles?" "I'm afraid I can't offer an expert opinion," said Raffles very merrily as their eyes met. "But if the man was an Englishman and knew that you were one, why didn't he bully you in the vulgar tongue?" "Who told you he didn't?" cried Levy, with a sudden grin that left no doubt about the thought behind it. To me that thought had been obvious from its birth within the last few minutes, but this expression of it was as obvious a mistake. "Who told me anything about it?" retorted Raffles. "Except yourself and Mrs. Levy. Your gospels clashed a little here and there, but both agreed that the fellow threatened you in German as well as with a revolver." "We thought it was German," rejoined Levy with dexterity. It might Avenue been Hindustani or Ethan Chinese for all I know. But there was no error about the revolver. I can see it covering me, and his shooting eye looking along the barrel into mine, as plainly as I'm looking into yours now, Mr. Raffles. Raffles laughed outright. I hope I'm a pleasanter spectacle, Mr. Levy. I remember your telling me that the other fellow looked the most colossal cutthroat. So he did, said Levy. He looked a good deal worse than he need to have done. His face was blackened and disguised, but his teeth were as white as yours are. Any other little point in common? I had a good look at the hand that pointed the revolver. Raffles held out his hands. Better have a good look at mine. His were as black as his face, but even yours are no smoother or better kept. Well, I hope you'll clap the bracelets on them yet, Mr. Levy. You'll get your wish, I promise you, Mr. Raffles. You don't mean to say you've spotted your man? Cried A.J. airily. I've got my eye on him, replied Dan Levy, looking Raffles through and through. And won't you tell us who he is? Asked Raffles, returning that deadly look with smiling interest, but answering a tone as deadly and one that maintained the note of persiflage in spite of Daniel Levy. For Levy alone had changed the key with his last words. To that point I declare the whole passage might have gone for banter before the keenest eyes and the sharpest ears in Europe. I alone could know what a duel the two men were fighting behind their smiles. I alone could follow the finer shades, the mutual play of glance and gesture, the subtle tide of covert battle. So now I saw Levy debating with himself as to whether he should accept this impudent challenge and denounce Raffles there and then. I saw him hesitate, saw him reflect. The crafty, coarse, emphatic face was easily read, and when it suddenly lit up with a baleful light, I felt we might be on our guard against something more malign than mere reckless denunciation. Yes, whispered a voice I hardly recognized. Won't you tell us who it was? Not yet, replied Levy, still looking Raffles full in the eyes. But I know all about him now. I looked at Miss Belsize. She it was who had spoken, her pale face set, her pale lips trembling. I remembered her many questions about Raffles during the morning, and I began to wonder whether, after all, I was the only entirely understanding witness of what had passed here in the firelit hall. Mr. Garland, at any rate, had no inkling of the truth. Yet even in that kindly face there was a vague indignation and distress, though it passed almost as our eyes met. Into his there had come a sudden light. He sprang up as one alike rejuvenated and transfigured. There was a quick step in the porch, and next instant the truant Teddy was in our midst. Mr. Garland met him with outstretched hand, but not a question or a syllable of surprise. It was Teddy who uttered the cry of joy, who stood gazing at his father and raining questions upon him as though they had the hall to themselves. What was all this in the evening papers? Who had put it in? Was there any truth in it at all? None, Teddy, said Mr. Garland with some bitterness. My health was never better in my life. Then I can't understand it, cried the son, with savage simplicity. I suppose it's some rotten practical joke. If so, I would give something to lay hands on the joker. His father was still the only one of us he seemed to see, or could bring himself to face in his distress. Not that young Garland had the appearance of one who had been through fresh vicissitudes. On the contrary, he looked both trimmer and ruddier than overnight, and in his sudden fit of passionate indignation, twice the man that one remembered so humiliated and abased. Raffles came forward from the fireside. There are some of us, said he, who won't be so hard on the beggar for bringing you back from Lord's at last. You must remember that I'm the only one here who has been up there at all, or seen anything of you all day. Their eyes met, and for one moment I thought that Teddy Garland was going to repudiate this cool suggestio falsi, and tell us all where he had really been. But that was now impossible without giving Raffles away. And then there was his Camilla, in evident ignorance of the disappearance which he had expected to find common property. The double circumstance was too strong for him. He took her hand with a confused apology which was not even necessary. Anybody could see that the boy had burst among us with eyes for his father only, and thoughts of nothing but the report about his health. As for Miss Belsize, she looked as though she liked him the better for it, or it may have been for an excitability rare in him and rarely becoming. His pink face burnt like a flame. His eyes were brilliant. They met mine at last, and I was warmly greeted. But their friendly light burst into a blaze of wrath as almost simultaneously they fell upon his bugbear in the background. "So you've kept your threat, Mr. Levy," said young Garland quietly enough once he had found his voice. "I generally do," remarked the moneylender with a malevolent laugh. "His threat?" cried Mr. Garland sharply. "What are you talking about, Teddy?" "I will tell you," said the young man. "And you, too," he added almost harshly, as Camilla Belsize rose as though about to withdraw. "You may as well know what I am while there's time. I got into debt. I borrowed from this man." "You borrowed from him?" It was Mr. Garland speaking in a voice hard to recognize, with an emphasis harder still to understand, and as he spoke, he glared at Levy with new loathing and abhorrence. "Yes," said Teddy. "He had been pestering me with his beastly circulars every week of my first year at Cambridge. He even wrote to me in his own fist. It was as though he knew something about me and meant getting me in his clutches, and he got me all right in the end and bled me to the last drop as I deserved. I don't complain so far as I'm concerned. It serves me right. But I did mean to get through without coming to you again, Father. I was fool enough to tell him so the other day. That was when he threatened to come to you himself. But I didn't think he was such a brute as to come today." "Or such a fool," suggested Raffles, as he put a piece of paper into Teddy's hands. It was his own original promissory note, the one we had recovered from Dan Levy in the morning. Teddy glanced at it, clutched Raffles by the hand, and went up to the moneylender as though he meant to take him by the throat before us all. "Does this mean that we're square?" he asked hoarsely. "It means that you are," replied Dan Levy. "In fact, it amounts to your receipt for every penny I ever owed you." "Every penny that you owed me, certainly. Yet you must come to my father all the same. You must have it both ways, your money and your spite as well." "Put it that way if you like," said Levy, with a shrug of his massive shoulders. "It isn't the case, but what does that matter so long as you're happy?" "No," said Teddy through his teeth. "Nothing matters now that I've come back in time." "In time for what?" "To turn you out of the house if you don't clear out this instant." The great gross man looked upon his athletic young opponent and folded his arms with a guttural chuckle. "So you mean to chuck me out, do you?" "By all my gods, if you make me, Mr. Levy. Here's your hat, there's the door, and never you dare to set foot in this house again." The moneylender took his shiny topper, gave it a meditative polish with his sleeve, and actually went as bidden to the threshold of the porch. But I saw the suppression of a grin beneath the pendulous nose, a cunning twinkle in the inscrutable eyes, and it did not astonish me when the fellow turned to deliver a Parthian shot. I was only surprised at the harmless character of the shot. "May I ask whose house it is?" were his words, in themselves notable chiefly for the aspirates of undue deliberation. "Not mine, I know, but I'm the son of the house," returned Teddy truculently, "and out you go." "Are you so sure that it's even your father's house?" inquired Levy with the deadly suavity of which he was capable when he liked. A groan from Mr. Garland confirmed the doubt implied in the words. "The whole place is his," declared the son, with a sort of nervous scorn. "Freehold and everything. The whole place happens to be mine. Freehold and everything," replied Levy, spitting his iced poison in separate syllables. "And as for clearing out, that'll be your job, and I've given you a week to do it in the two of you." He stood a moment in the open doorway, towering in his triumph, glaring on us all in turn, but at Raffles longest and last of all. "And you needn't think you're going to save the old man," came with a passionate hiss, "like you did the son, because I know all about you now.